This is Law Bytes, a podcast with Michael Geist.
For some in this community, the only reliable way to access the internet is to come and wait for the bus, pay $5 to take a 35-minute ride to a nearby city, and then log on to Wi-Fi at a business there. Deanna John says the doctor who used to visit Chihuahua once a week said she could no longer see patients here because the internet connection wouldn't let her load her files. Then there's everything that people aren't able to do online.
And I think that our people could use more like training and, everything they could get out of the internet. They're not able to really get it.
The CRTC's goal is to connect all Canadians with quality high speed by 2030.
This week, a Canadian coalition of consumer advocates, civil society and social justice groups, policy experts, activists, and independent ISPs will come together in a national day of action to demand the immediate implementation of federal measures to deliver affordable internet and wireless services in Canada and to put an end to constantly increasing bills. If it feels like the issue of affordable universal internet access in Canada has been going on for decades, that's probably because it has. The very first broadband task force examined the issue nearly 20 years ago, and successive governments, both liberal and conservative, have left behind a long trail of unfulfilled promises. This week's Law Bytes podcast brings together three people that bring unique perspectives to the issue. Madeleine Redfern was the mayor of Iquluit, Nunuvut for nearly 10 years, and is currently the Chief Operating Officer of CanArctic Inuit Networks. Dr. Mary Cavanagh is the Director of the School of Information Studies at the University of Ottawa and has been actively engaged in research on consumer issues in the telecom marketplace, including the development of a secret shopper project that served as a model for a CRTC initiative. Matt Stein is the CEO of Distributel Communications, a leading independent ISP, and he's the chair of CNOC, the Competitive Network Operators of Canada. Madeleine, Mary, and Matt, along with me, Michael, all joined together for a virtual conversation on the impact of access at the community level, the effect on consumers, the state of competition, and what Canada should be doing about this issue. The National Day of Action takes place the day after this podcast is scheduled to be released. And it seems to me that the very fact that consumer groups, digital policy experts, companies, community organizations, and so many others felt that this was something that was needed really speaks volumes about the mounting frustration that we've seen with affordability and access when it comes to the internet in Canada. And really, I think the policy failures that now date back decades. So I'm grateful to all of you for joining me on the podcast. I'm hoping that we can have a conversation that really focuses on three issues: the impact of access at the community level, the impact certainly on consumers, and the state of competition. And then, of course, I want to kind of bring all of that home by talking a bit about what can be done about that. Why don't we start, though, with the impact on local communities? Madeleine, you joined us, and it took a while just even to be able to join us, given some of the connectivity challenges. Can you start us off with a little bit of a description of access in your community? What's it like? What's the cost, the speeds that you find in competition? And I guess most importantly, what's the impact that it has on the community?
Well, first of all, we're 100% satellite dependent in Iqaluit, which is the capital of Nunuvut, as well as the other 24 communities. But there are communities in Northwest Territories, one in Yukon, some in the northern parts of other provinces like Quebec, Nunavut, and that are also satellite dependent. So it's a challenge because there's, without a doubt, latency issues. It means that, I'm trying to get onto a website. Yesterday, I was trying to fill in a government funding application and trying to use one of their online sort of mapping tools, and I just could not sign on, like for the life of me. Actually, I think I tweeted that for trying to actually sign on to a webinar the other day, it took me 15 hours to prove that I was not a robot. Because it wouldn't let the message or the connection sort of be received in time to prove that. So it's also extremely expensive. Again, my internet bill for the month of January was about $1,200, which means that I spent, let's say about $800 in overages charges, because we don't have unlimited. And every sort of bit of data, it just costs money. And that doesn't include my cable. That does not include my cell phone. I mean, there's no bundling here. And in the past, I would be able to travel to conferences or meetings, and I would have my travel paid for. But now, I attend by Zoom, and I tried to explain that I've got a package that is the highest for business, and that my overages comes in $100 chunks. When they say, well, the people just don't understand, and it's not like I'm paying $1,200 for like really good connectivity. I'm paying $1,200 for sheer frustration day after day, where I'm having problems sending emails with attachments. I can't get onto websites. I'm not Netflixing. I don't even have that luxury. I'm just trying to do day-to-day business, as is everyone else in my community. Wow.
I mean, those numbers, I think, frankly, are stunning for anyone that I live in Ottawa. And so that sounds more like an annual cost as opposed to a monthly cost. How is that in any way affordable for the average consumer who's trying to have their kids connect to their schools or to participate, as you say, in everyday society that's so dependent on connectivity?
Well, unfortunately, it means that in some cases, people actually have to choose, to sort of be internet cops and limit participation of their family members on the internet. And I've known people to, even try to sort of decide, am I, buying groceries, or do I, have some internet? And that's a really tough call, because the internet has become such a necessity, and to be completely disconnected, especially during COVID, it's a horrible sort of scenario to be in for many people.
And is there any competition? I mean, you mentioned that it's all satellite based. Is there a number of providers that at least have some impact in reducing cost, or are you basically left with a very limited number of provider choices?
You don't have much options. Even some of the packages where one of the companies sort of says, well, we provide unlimited, but then people say, well, yeah, unlimited to virtually non-existent connection is not very good anyway. So you have no real good, unfortunately, a choice, because at the end of the day, those same internet service providers are for the most part buying the same satellite service, which is just really slow and really expensive. So there's not much that can be done when 80 to 90% of those internet service providers are using the same, backhaul provider.
Well, okay. So significant competition problems. I want to come back to what can be done to improve matters in your community, but I'd love to hear about other communities as well. Matt, why don't you tell us a little bit about your ISP and
Sure.
some of the communities that it operates in, and some of the issues that you've seen?
Sure, absolutely. So our ISP, Distributel, we've partnered with a good number of local communities to provide, in a rural setting, ultra high-speed broadband. And of course, we also have hundreds of thousands of Canadians that buy our broadband services in urban areas too. But if I put that aside, specifically in some far-off places, a great example would be in northern Quebec, where we partnered with the local communities. There are already 12 up, and we have, I guess, more than 50 other communities in progress right now, where we have various states of 12 communities already are constructed and are being expanded and so forth, where thousands of Canadians now do have gigabit capable speeds or gig fiber to the home. And so we've been able to do that in a number of places in northern Quebec, and now are branching out to other parts of the country as well. And then I guess I should say, from an affordability standpoint, it's obviously a very different story than what we just heard. those are the same prices that we charge in downtown Montreal, as an example. So it's a very, very different state of affairs there.
Okay. And what's the competition like in some of those smaller communities that you try to operate in? Are you so for example, are you the competition, so to speak, as against some of the larger providers?
Well, sort of yes and no. There might be, say, the local phone company, but most of those communities have limited, if any, DSL, let alone anything better. Most of those communities don't have cable. In a sense, we're the only provider there. Certainly, we're the only provider for broadband services, or I'll say modern broadband services.
Okay, so at least there is that, but the competition's still limited. Madeleine's. Sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, I was just going to say it's true. Competition is limited, but we were careful right from the beginning to try to find ways to bring some of the values that competition brings elsewhere to those communities by indexing all of the pricing in all of those communities to a large urban area that we felt was an appropriate proxy. So as I said, in northern Quebec, all of those communities and all of the pricing in them is indexed to the Montreal area, which is hundreds or even thousands, or I'll say nearly 1,000 kilometers away, just really far from there, kind of thing.
Okay, that's good to know. It's interesting to know that you've been able to keep prices at that level, in communities outside of the larger urban areas where there is that kind of competition. The impact obviously on consumers is huge when you think of these costs that we just heard about, especially in the north. But there's been a lot of concern about the consumer impact for a long time, and it seems to me just about everybody has their own story. In my case, it actually involves my father-in-law just in the last couple of weeks, who saw his bill. He's with Rogers in Ottawa, go up by more than 50% from what was a previous 1-year deal to an inability to get any sort of deal, and the cost just skyrocketed. It took 3 phone calls continuously with different customer service agents to try to find something that was affordable for someone who lives on a government pension. So there are real challenges. And Mary, you've done some exceptional work taking a look at some of the consumer-related issues when it comes to telecom. Can you describe a little bit some of the research and some of the findings that you came up with?
Yeah, Michael, but before I get into my work, I just want to know, in your dad's story, did he threaten to leave Rogers? Was that part of the way that he got his a price that worked for him? Because that's often what we see.
That was it was exactly that. It was my father-in-law, and So what it took was, the first time was just a regular call saying, is this possible for the bill to have jumped this much? And the answer was yes. And they weren't able to come up with anything. And it took several calls. And it was finally on the last call to basically say, this is a call where we are leaving, because this is literally not affordable, until we were able to come up with something that was still not as good as the prior deal and actually downgraded the internet service in order to do it. But there was really no choice from a cost perspective.
And this and our work, we did work with wireless consumers in 2016-17. The CRTC launched their own research in 2019-20 on wireless also, but internet service and wireless consumers, it's the same kind of story, and it's your father-in-law's story. It's misleading and aggressive sales practices, misleading information, the things change, the very lack of instability, unpredictability, unreliability. I don't understand the information. I can't get the same story twice from the same company. I can't compare across. Deep inequities, and the inequities come in all kinds of different ways, as the north and remote and rural is an inequity that it's at a technical level, at a price level, understanding. You had to perhaps help your father-in-law intercede a bit. I don't know if you flexed any of your muscles from your work in any way, but every single person is going through this kind of experience one way or another, and we're exhausted. And generally, I don't want to say for the ISPs that are, I have home internet, it works for me. but I rue the day when something goes wrong because I don't want to have to get into that kind of negotiation. So it's deeply inequitable. That's what and that's what we found. And unfortunately, the remedies and the mechanisms that the CRTC is putting into the language is to empower consumers in the marketplace. I would say is generally not working very well because the same types of problems continue to occur.
Yeah, that was certainly my experience, and I interceded entirely, not doing any sort of name dropping, just being a customer, saying that our family spends a lot of money on communication services, and we're just trying to help out a family member. How did the CRTC react to some of your research, and what kind of steps did they put forward, albeit ones that you've just suggested are inadequate?
Well, what we were trying to do is to get recognition from the telecoms to put documentation and sales practices in place that were sort of standardized before a customer signs the contract. So there's a lot of procedure after you have signed a deal with a telecom provider, via wireless, and now they have an internet code, which they introduced in 2020, and that followed CRTC's language following the success of the wireless code, which from our point of view would say is not really that successful. So documentation, a critical information summary that you get after you've signed a contract. Well, unfortunately, that doesn't help you compare apples and apples across providers. It doesn't help you understand. And the interests at the sales perspective, whether you're talking to someone on the telephone or you're face to face in a kiosk, we're mostly doing things online these days, is that they can't give you the same information, and their interest is a sale and your money, and your interest is access and service for money, but there's a use. I want to use the service I want to buy from you for all of these things, and the world is organizing, so I have to use it. And you want to take my money, which is fine, but the interests are quite different. And the service providers told us repeatedly in the last hearings that they have practices built in for training and so on. But we were unable to verify across, in a very small sample actually, that these practices are consistent. So that consistency, language, for people with disabilities, there are other kinds of needs that they have. It's not very effective.
Yeah, no, that certainly I think will resonate with a lot of people. Madeleine, can you tell me a bit about what the consumer experience is like in the North? You've obviously talked about how it's satellite only based, but it sounds like there are significant challenges. And I guess I wonder, are consumers entitled to anything when, essentially if the service doesn't work?
Well, it should work. And there are some, technicals, relatively, I think, easy fixes that even Northwest Tel and Telesat have acknowledged, could have been done. And now there are plans to do it. And when the recent $49.9 million of federal investment to upgrade our telecommunications did result in faster internet when there's good weather. But the instant that there's, blizzard, rain, fog, the signal deteriorates, which, reality is that we live in the conditions where it's not 365 days for 24 hours a day, good weather. So that is, not really acceptable. As I said, the experience is, it means that sometimes when you go to the grocery store or you want to buy gas or get money out of the ATM or bank teller, you literally do not know when your card is going to work or not work. So it affects businesses, it affects the residents to that extent. I lived in Oh, I remember in October 2011 when the satellite went down for 22 hours and the entire northern part of Canada went black. So there were no telephone calls in and out of those northern regions. The planes were grounded. As I just said, people couldn't do basic business transaction, and we're so dependent on paying with debit and credit cards. I don't usually carry cash or even have cash, at my home. So it's it's when we say that internet and connectivity is a basic necessity, it is. You don't have it, everything comes to a complete grinding halt. And that's not good for work productivity for any level of government. No one's, I think, quantified what the loss of productivity or the loss of economic development, but it's tremendous. And that divide is just getting bigger and bigger despite some of the historical investments. And we need to be more strategic. And we don't even have a strategy about how we're going to improve it, which I think fundamentally is a problem. And having funding programs is not a strategy. The ISPs or companies competing for that, again, is not a strategy. We are not going to achieve any of the targets or the goals that the federal government has stated without having national and regional strategies. How are we going to do it? Where? How much? And by when?
Thanks for that. Speaking of strategies, Matt, you've been involved obviously with what has been almost continuous discussion of how Canada is going to ensure greater competition and address some of these issues. Although I have to say that when Madeleine describes the implications and the impact, it's dramatic in ways that we don't experience necessarily here in Ottawa. But we do experience certainly the cost issues and the competition issues. Can you start us off, I guess, by talking a bit about the issues around competition and pricing? I think there's a public perception that Canadians pay a lot, both for broadband and for wireless services, and the competition remains an issue. Is that your experience coming at it as a marketplace participant?
Absolutely. I think that there's a number of aspects of competition that we look for here in Canada and that we seek, but it's I could talk a little bit about why it's been on the ropes for so long, but no, you're absolutely right. Even some of the other examples that were shared here on the call, consumers, when they go to a competitor, such as the members of CNOC, I mean, you asked me here as part of Distributel, but we're part of an industry association called CNOC, and CNOC is the Competitive Network Operators of Canada. The members of CNOC aren't known for those kinds of things. We are known for frankly, providing a better grade of service, a person that you could talk to when there's a problem, and fair pricing. So those are sort of the things that people have just come to expect from competitors, and also innovation too. But it's been a long time that we've been sort of on the ropes due to some of the regulatory challenges we face. I don't know if you'd like me to go into that very much, or if that's where you're hoping I'd delve into.
Yeah, well, I think it would be useful. I mean, I don't know if we want to get deep in the weeds, but I think people who pay some attention to these issues know that there has been ongoing hearings and almost dialogue at the CRTC. Can you give us a sense of how that has played out and what the impact has been on CNOC members, let's say, on some of these independent providers?
Sure. So that's right. So the independent providers, or sometimes referred to as third-party internet access providers or wholesalers, is a bunch of terms that get floated around, pay for an access. They pay for the last mile. They pay for the connectivity into the home. They still provide the internet service or the phone service or the TV service or whatnot that goes on top of it. They do all of the customer relationships and so forth. But they have to pay for that connection throughout your neighborhood into your homes. And that is paid for with a price set by the CRTC. The CRTC sets it. They mandate or they require the big incumbents to provide that last mile service to the independent provider. And it's a way of ensuring that there is competitive choice, that there are competitors out there that can offer a better grade of service, that can offer different things, that can offer better prices, and so forth and so forth, and in new innovative services and so forth. The problem is that those prices were set a really long time ago. And those prices have been under review what seems like forever. They've been under review or under discussion in some way since 2013, and very intensely since 2016. But when the CRTC finally completed a multi-year long process with thousands of pages of submissions and so forth in 2019, in the summer of 2019, amazingly, a year and a half plus ago, they changed the prices. They realized that they'd made some grave errors way back when. And they said, listen, these prices were wrong. The independent ISPs have been overcharged. The incumbents have to give the money back. And I would say even more importantly, set a new price going forward. And that new price going forward was far less. And one of the things that the independents are very good at doing is converting the low cost to a low consumer price. So when that happened, a bunch of the independents, my company included, a bunch of independents went out, lowered prices, increased speeds. Like I said, efficiently converted that lower cost into a lower price for Canadians. Unfortunately, through a string of appeals, within their legal right, but seemingly, and some would say a bit of an abusive process, appealed off in every which direction. The incumbents have found a way to make that fight over costing take much, much longer, and we're still waiting for final decisions now. The federal court is finished with it, Supreme Court is finished with it, and now we're waiting on the CRTC. And actually, we think the CRTC is getting pretty close to evaluating the decision they made in 2019 and announcing their decision. And then all that's left really is the federal government to not put their hand on the scale again and to just let the CRTC get their work done and lower prices for Canadians.
Okay, that's I think a perfect conclusion to segue into what comes next and what we ought to do. It's a really helpful summary in terms of where things are at. It's I think for many it's been a really long road, at least in terms of following it, which is why I think some people may kind of start tuning out, because it just seems that whole regulatory process is filled with appeals to governments and to the courts and then to the CRTC again, and you just never know when there's going to be an end to the road. And it sounds like you may be heading there. You talked about what the government can do. I'm curious to hear from all three of you about what you think government should be doing, and perhaps others in this process. Why don't we start with you, Madeleine? What do you think can be done to improve access? You talked about the need for a more strategic approach. What are some of the kinds of things that you think we should be doing?
Well, if a telecommunications company applies for and receives public subsidies, whether for capital or for service, there should be more transparency. I recognize that we have a similar sort of approach with the Nutrition North program, which subsidizes food for communities that are only fly-in, and consumers have demanded and actually received, adjustments to that program so that at the shelf we can see what the original price would be and what the subsidized price is. We see it in our receipts at the till. The government of Canada has service auditors that look at the recipients' books one-on-one to make sure that they actually see that the public funds or the subsidies are not just going to bolstering profit of those companies. So, I don't see why we can't do something similar where there is a requirement for the companies receiving it, to prove to the government of Canada, to prove to the customers that the subsidies are really bringing down the internet costs and making it more affordable. There needs to definitely be more transparency and accountability, because year after year we see the large telecommunications company boasting $2.5 or $3 billion profits, net profits. And yet we don't see, the large telecoms expanding their services into rural, remote areas or underserved communities. They say it's too expensive, and yet it is effectively a public utility or public necessity. But we've moved away from the utility model in telecommunications to a business model. So right now I'm, working with some business partners to bring fiber into my part of the region, and we chose a utility model that makes the internet, as affordable as possible, especially since we're seeking federal investment for that. And so it is a business decision, and it is a decision that is being bolstered by, as I said, the government of Canada. And there are policy options, and I don't think we fully investigated them and required, as I said, ensuring that there really are proper, good return on public investments, which is effectively making the internet as affordable as possible right across the country.
Okay. So, we hear so much of these almost check cutting exercises in terms of government putting money in, but far less in terms of the accountability and the impact that it has in terms of sparking some of the kind of competition and accountability that you're talking about. And that sounds like a really excellent place to start. Mary, you appeared before the CRTC. You've raised a number of possibilities, whether at the CRTC or with the CCTS, which is nominally supposed to be there for consumers. What more can be done so that people don't have to enter into these kind of dreaded phone calls that feel a bit like theater, where you say, listen, I'm about to cancel unless you come up with a better deal. And it takes that to actually engage in any sort of real conversation.
Exactly. I'm so glad that you brought up the CCTS, the Commissioner for Complaints on Telecom Services, because I think one of the places, that's the agent, the CRTC's delegated authority for mediating consumer issues with their telecom providers, and sales practices and misleading information is one of the biggest issues that gets raised. But it's a post-contract, the problem has happened, the issue has happened, and that's a whole, sorry to be, in the government process, it's a whole procedure for resolving complaints. I'd like to see something that is much more proactive, both from the CRTC and perhaps the commissioner could be the Commissioner for Complaints, the CCTS, could create some strategies and mechanisms that are proactive, that create processes that really give information up front. The other thing we don't find out from the CCTS every year in terms of the complaints, I'd like to know that a lot of the detail about those complaints. Are there best practices that could be identified out of the resolution of the complaints that are reported to the CCTS? What can we learn? Again, it's a very, very closed, opaque system. It's very much oriented in federal government process, and it's I suggest it lacks a street view. It lacks the ordinary everyday person's perspective. And if you start from the perspective of the consumer rather than end with the consumer at the end of the road, the person receiving, if you start with the consumer's needs and start to build procedures, policies, I don't know what it is, ecosystem, strengthen the ecosystem, which would involve all the agencies. It needs a lot of work, and it needs to start from the consumer's point of view.
Yeah, it's a fabulous point. It strikes me that the former chair of the CRTC, Jean-Pierre Blais, emphasized quite a lot in terms of some of the policy decisions that the CRTC took during his time as chair, the need to put the consumer at the center of their communication system. And that kind of applied in a whole series of different areas. They may have had mixed results on certain things, but that was at least the starting point. We have seen, I think, under the current chair, the CRTC drift away from that a little bit. And we certainly don't hear nearly as much about the consumer and the consumer's interests as we did, at least for a few years there.
In very practical ways also, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Matt, you mentioned that it's up to the CRTC to kind of move forward. What do you see as the sort of the next steps, both for the regulator and I suppose for the government as well, which tends to talk a lot about the importance of broadband, but as we've been hearing, the results have not been great.
Do you mind if I build on something Mary said?
No, by all means, go ahead.
Sure. Pardon me for making another pitch for competition, but I'm also going to suggest that in addition to all the other great ways of doing the policy work to find what the source of complaints are and how we could address them, sometimes there also are options that are being done and played out every single day by competitors. And that's not a pitch that everybody should just switch to a competitor, but perhaps there are some principles that have been adopted by competitors pretty widely or pretty broadly that could be brought into more common use. And I'll just cite one example. Earlier we were talking about the idea that somebody had to phone and call their provider and say, why did my price go up this much? And how can we bring it back down? It took several phone calls and a threatening to cancel. Well, I'll give you a quick example. One of the CNOC members a couple of years ago made the rule and stated clearly that from that point forward, while they still had a group that was responsible for dealing with cancellation requests, the same offers that were being made available to that group that they could pitch customers on and help customers through and so forth, the same offers must be available to every single rep that answers the phone in the entire company. So you didn't have to get transferred 3 times to get the right deal, and that everybody would be trained to help customers get the right price and so forth. And it may seem like a small thing, but it was so well regarded and so well received, many other CNOC members also implemented it. I can't say that every single one, I don't know that, but many other ones did as well. And so it's a small change to say that everybody has access to those price points, but you no longer need to hear from the person that you're phoning at the cable company or the phone company, sorry, I can't do any better, but let me hand you off to another group. So it's a small little change. Anyway.
Okay. It's, obviously in competition helps spark, I think, some of that kind of innovation. And so that becomes absolutely critical. From a pure policy perspective, why don't you wrap us up with the government, as I say, has focused quite a lot on broadband. They've got government ministers that talk a bit about it. In your view, is there more that they could be doing? Is there more that the CRTC could be doing?
I think the CRTC is doing good work. Obviously, I'd like them to get it done faster, but regulation's not always fast. So it'd be great to move quicker, but I respect what they're doing. So I'm not so sure I have much advice there. What I would say, though, is for the government, in the last federal election, they made clear that wireless and wireline broadband pricing needed to come down. They promised that they would address it. Yet, from last year until now, from last summer until now, it seems almost like they flinched, or maybe they became less sure about that. So I would hope that they make clear to Canadians and to all who are listening that competition is critical. And they state very clearly that, this phrase protecting investment actually is protecting investor returns. And we all know that that just means leaving high prices in place. So they need to make that clear. They need to make their stance on this clear for all Canadians. And then finally, I would hope that they immediately shut down or shut out the incumbent delay tactics that we continue to suffer with every day.
Okay. So more that can be done on the ground, more that can be done at a policy level. And as we've heard from both Mary and Madeleine, much more that can be done strategically within communities and at the federal level. It's in some ways discouraging to think that broadband task force dates back in Canada 2 decades now. So this has been literally a discussion for 2 decades in terms of how to ensure that everyone has affordable high-speed internet access. But it sounds like on the one hand, this discussion is going to continue, but I'm grateful to all of you for coming on the podcast, both to share your experiences, but I think also, just as importantly, some of the kinds of solutions that are open and available to policymakers, regulators, and people within their local communities. So Madeleine, Mary, and Matt, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That's the Law Bytes podcast for this week. If you have comments, suggestions, or other feedback, Write to Law Bytes at pobox.com. Follow the podcast on Twitter at Law Bytes Pod or Michael Geist at mgeist. You can download the latest episodes from my website at michaelgeist.ca or subscribe via RSS at Apple Podcast, Google, or Spotify. The Law Bytes podcast is produced by Gerardo Lebron Laboy. Music by the Laboy brothers, Gerardo and Jose Lebron Laboy. Credit information for the clips featured in this podcast can be found in the show notes for this episode at michaelgeist.ca. I'm Michael Geist. Thanks for listening, and see you next time.